Hi, and welcome to part 2 of session 3 of History of Healing. We're diving now into the ancient civilizations, and we'll start with Mesopotamia. But first, to just define the term civilization, because this is the first time humans are coming into this state. So it's the state of human social development characterized by advanced agriculture, long-distance trade, occupational specialization, and urbanism. So when we talk about civilizations, that's what we're talking about. People organizing themselves according to things like more advanced technology. And I'm not talking about mobile phones, I'm talking about agricultural technology or blacksmithing and those sorts of things that were becoming more craft trades at that time. So the first cities were established in the Fertile Crescent, and that is where the advent of agriculture was. So this was, again, around the 10,000 BCE mark of time, and agriculture was the key to allow both greater concentrations of people in one place and the need for coming together for purposes of trade, because it was the beginning of the concept of ownership of something. And so this was a major development in human thought, the concept of ownership of land in this instance, or ownership of goods that were being traded. And so the first cities that were developed in the Fertile Crescent are listed there to show you some time frames for some of the different places. Some of them I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but Jericho, obviously one of the older one of the older developed cities in the world, around 9,000 BCE, onto Memphis, Egypt, around 3100 BCE. So this is this span of time across the area known as the Fertile Crescent. And you can see there in the image what would be labeled Mesopotamia, as well as Upper and Lower Egypt there on the very northeast corner of the African continent by the Sinai Peninsula. So a city in these terms is a center of population, a center of commerce and culture, and it would have been a settlement of significant size and importance, and usually associated with the availability of a good water supply and access to a wider outlying area with either sea, river, or road access, and that would have been for purposes of trade. What we have happening around this time is of development of civilization is development of writing. And it could be that one of the things that spurred this on was that if you're trading, you need to be able to communicate or record things in writing. And so we really can't explore the origins of healing and medicine without mentioning the development of writing. Writing developed hand in hand with civilization, and the earliest written records are in Mesopotamia in the Sumerian civilization about 5,500 years ago, so about 3,500 BCE. And the land between two rivers, between the Tigris and Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq, northeast Syria, and southeast Turkey, southwest Iran, is the area that we're talking about of when we refer to Mesopotamia. And this was the cradle of civilization. So it was the home of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians in the Assyrian Empire. And I'm sure that you will have heard of some of those peoples in your past study of history. Egyptian hieroglyphics came about 500 years later than the system of writing that was developed in the Fertile Crescent, and so but they were somewhat different systems of writing. One didn't grow out of the other one, if that makes sense. So the Egyptian form was a hieroglyphic form of writing, and the development of writing was really driven by the result of political expansion in ancient cultures. And so they needed to transmit information, maintain financial accounts, keeping historical records, etc. And politics were starting to be more on the scene. So you develop a civilization, and one of the characteristics of civilizations is government. The earliest alphabetic or phonetic system of writing was about 1400 BCE, and that was in the pre-Greek civilization of the Mycenaeans, and we'll meet them in a few weeks when we do our Greco-Roman lecture. There was also, interestingly, a system of writing that arose completely independently in Central America around 600 BCE. And that's pretty remarkable when you think about it. I mean, obviously, there wasn't at that point in time an exchange of information between Africa and the Middle East and the area of the pre-Greek in the Mediterranean and South America. So we know that one didn't develop from the other. So we mentioned this history because it's through the development of writing that we now know more about the historical systems of medicine. So we come away from relying entirely on the archaeological record, and we get to understand more about what was going on in these cultures, and we don't have to speculate anymore or as much. So the area of Mesopotamia, usually referred to as the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and you can sort of spot those out on this picture. The Tigris River is here, the Euphrates River is here, and Mesopotamia is this area that is called the Fertile Crescent, just in here, and it's greener as an indication of the fertility of it. So the advent of agriculture at the beginning of the Neolithic period around 10,000 BCE was in this area. Agriculture was born here. And it's probably more properly defined as an area that's bounded on the northeast by the Zagros Mountains, so that's over here, and on the southwest by the edge of the Arabian Plateau, which is here. And that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Anti-Taurus Mountains in the northwest, and the Taurus Mountains are up here. So it's really that whole central area in there that's in green, not just the proper area between the two rivers there. So in present day, this is the area of Iraq and Kuwait, as well as parts of Syria and Turkey. And it's interesting to note that farming in this region was only possible after the invention of artificial irrigation that allowed the movement of large amounts of water out of the rivers and into the plains. So you would kind of think that farming would have started someplace where the land and the annual rainfall were actually more naturally suited to farming, because it would have been easier. They certainly, it was a much harder thing that they were starting at some place that required irrigation. But perhaps the domestication of crops was more pressing here because the area naturally didn't produce much plant food because it was arid. And so there was pressure to find another way to produce food. So in the Neolithic period and the Bronze Age, this area was where the early civilization of the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians was, as I mentioned. And we, taking each of these civilizations separately would really be beyond the scope of this class. It would be a whole lecture, each one of them. So we're going to address them collectively as a region, but with some emphasis on the oldest one of them, which is the Sumerians. So just keep in mind that when we talk about these civilizations collectively, it's not really doing justice to them, but we have to do that out of necessity due to time constraints. So the history and culture of this area, there were many cultures and languages across the region and across time in this area. Unlike in Egypt, it didn't have any geographic unity of culture. So there was these multiple civilizations existing, which I mentioned, and they were not unified in terms of their cultural or perhaps spiritual influences. There was early documented mathematics and astrology born in this region. And when we talk about early documentation, we're talking about now we've invented writing. We haven't, they have invented writing, and we're actually documenting things in writing. Versus in the last part of this lecture, I was talking about how we knew that the folks earlier on, before the advent of agriculture, had some understanding of astrology or astronomy because they made their circular structures with the openings facing where the sun would shine on the solstice or the equinox. So they had an understanding of the movements of the sun at the very least. But now we have documentation of that because we have writing. Also, legal codes. So with the advent of writing, and as I mentioned, more government, or the structure of government being set up now, there are laws. And so legal codes are established during this, in this civilization, or in these civilizations. Major advances in engineering and building and irrigation, as I mentioned before, and then literacy and literature were highly developed in the Mesopotamian region during this period of time. There was also development of specialized crafts and division of labor, so people had things that they specialized in terms of the work that they did, which is different from a farming culture where farmers tend to be sort of jacks of all trades in many ways. Giving up the nomadic lifestyle and moving into the farming lifestyle really increased infant survival rates, and so the population grew, though the development of the array of civilizations that I was talking about took thousands of years for those to develop. Over time, there was an organized way of city life that developed with different trades outside of farming, including potters and weavers, carpenters, shipbuilders, and later mining and blacksmiths. Bricks and early precursors to concrete were developed in aid of building and engineering, and clay was a major natural asset within that region. The image here on the slide is a reconstruction of a Sumerian structure that's part of a temple complex, and this was achieved by translation of a text that detailed its design. So these were like early engineering or architectural plans that have been interpreted for a reconstruction of this structure. So with the cities and the early days of trade developing, there was property to protect, and the first warfare began to develop beyond the earlier types of tribal warfare that we believe occurred, and why so many of those men had head injuries in the last section. The spirituality of the Mesopotamian civilizations was pantheistic, which means that there was everything in the existing universe, everything in it was seen as being equivalent to God. So everything was God. And there would be no separate God, so no sort of father God, no mother goddess, but the combined substances and laws and forces within the universe, everything is God. That wasn't the word that they used, obviously. They had more than 1,000 named deities that represented God. And so if you think about other polytheistic religions that we know that represent that have multiple gods, like Hinduism, for example, what these are different personalities or different archetypes, different human characteristics that are personified within a deity to represent a face of God, essentially. They had temples with altars that were built for these deities, and they also had burial practices, burying their dead in cemeteries. There were councils of both male and female gods, and there appears in these civilizations to have been a fair bit of equality between men and women. But later that equality started shifting towards men holding greater power, and that is a pattern that we will see over many of the civilizations and cultures that we study this semester. The burial of people included pottery being placed in their graves, and that was an indication that they were providing for the needs of the deceased after death. So that indicates something about their belief system there. The image here on the slide is a restored version of the Mesopotamian goddess of Ishtar. She's the goddess of fertility, love, sexuality, and war. And so the same goddess was over love and war, which is an interesting juxtaposition. And our celebration in the West of the holiday of Easter with rabbits and eggs is said to have come from this goddess originally. So her name is Ishtar, which is very similar to Easter. and she was the goddess of fertility. Rabbits are a symbol of fertility because of their rapid reproductive habits. And that lore filtered through pagan cultures around and through the same times and later, further west as spirituality migrated west, and the rabbit and the egg came to us through the pagan cultures and into Christian practice, or into the habits of Christian cultures. The perspectives on disease in this culture were supernatural, as we will see in many early cultures. All illness was considered to be sent by the gods. There were demons or evil spirits that were sent as retribution for sin, or as malevolent visitation, so a visitation from an evil demon. And the gods needed to be constantly appeased by various practices in order to ward off illnesses. So this is the 1,000 deities that were mentioned on the last slide, and it was working. Folks were working to appease all of these deities in order to ward off illness. Diseased people were seen to be unclean and were avoided. So this was certainly far before the concept of contagion was conceptualized. That was redundant, but that there was some understanding that isolating a person who was diseased would help to prevent the spread of disease. So different gods were seen as causing different diseases, and there were various types of omens that were used to determine the causes of an illness and what the prognosis would be. So they would use astrological signs, dream interpretation, the presence of animals, various types of animals or colors in the person's environment. They didn't have any specific knowledge of anatomy or physiology documented in their record, and we don't have any evidence of human or animal dissection being performed for learning. So they didn't seem to have this interest to want to delve into the inside of the body to understand it. Their healing philosophy and their medicine was strongly based on religious and supernatural concepts, as it would be if you believe that all the causes of disease were brought on by displeased gods. So their treatment involved identifying the offending supernatural entity, the deity, and appeasing them. So there were specific healing deities. I don't know if I'll be pronouncing these right, but I'll give it a go. Ninib and Gula were the specific healing deities, and Ninazu was the lord of the healers. Medical practitioners or healers existed in Mesopotamia from around 2500 BCE, and they were closely intertwined with the fraternity of priests and the theocratic state culture there. So the state, the governmental culture there was theocratic, meaning it was a religious-based government, whereas nowadays we're accustomed to religion and government being separated. So the treatments that were offered by healing practitioners included amulets, offering amulets or incantations to exorcise evil spirits, but also included some types of empirical therapies that were known to help certain symptoms, such as herbs, for example. Most gods were considered to have some healing power, but the particular healing deities are there on the slide. And it's worth noting as well, there was the god of water, was also a key deity in medicine. And I'm not sure of the pronunciation. The spelling is E-A, so Ea, perhaps. And that is the image on the slide here, who is the god of water, a key deity in medicine. So water and medicine will be a common theme that we see throughout the semester. Healing practices were undertaken as well by seers. Most of the seers or the Baru were considered experts in divination, and they interpreted omens and made diagnoses and prognoses about whether somebody was going to live and what it was that was wrong with them. And then when they were diagnosing what was wrong, remember it was what deity exactly has been displeased in this situation. There were also exorcists. I mentioned on the last slide, exorcism of evil spirits was a practice in medicine. And Ashipu were the exorcists, and they used incantations for expelling demons and creating reconciliation with the gods. And then there were the healing priests, and the priests were the ones that were more adept at using things like herbal medicine and surgery and the things that we believe or that we associate with medicine more nowadays. And this is another common theme that we'll see throughout the semester, that of the religious practitioners of a culture being the ones that are also carrying the medicine of the culture. Most of the evidence that we have from this time comes from cuneiform clay tablets, and relatively few of those tablets are actually concerned with medical issues. And because of the nature of the writing of the Mesopotamian civilizations, we really haven't explored much what's on these cuneiform tablets. And so we know less about this area of medical history than we do about ancient Egypt, which will be in part 3 of our lectures. Interestingly, of the medical practitioners that are listed on this slide, the exorcists were actually the most influential of them all, and this was perhaps because the cause of illness was seen as being the demons invading the body. But after they had done their part, they would send the patient to the Asus, the healing priests, and they were responsible for actually administering remedies after the proper incantations or charms had been delivered. The literature doesn't contain any clinical case descriptions, so we don't have any kind of documentation of that kind. But we have an understanding that doctors kept cots in their place of business for treatment and recovery of patients, so patients could actually come and rest in the doctor's surgery. But there was nothing of what we would consider to be hospitals today. So you can see why that might have been necessary for a doctor to have a place for a person to rest. The healing priests also had surgical tools and other medical and pharmaceutical equipment. So the temple of the goddess Gula, who is the goddess of medicine and healing that we mentioned on the last slide, was also thought to have a curative effect for many illnesses, and so people would travel to this temple. And Gula, who was often accompanied by a dog, was one of the more significant gods of healing, and she's pictured here on this slide with her dog. The Assyrian herbal is a compilation in the early 1900s from the medical cuneiform tablets that I mentioned on the prior slide, and it contains about 250 plant, 120 mineral, and about 180 animal source medicines. So you can see animal sources of medicine and plants were not too far apart from each other, which is very, very different than what we think of medicine today. And of all of these, they include things such as laxatives, antiseptics, salves, astringents, opium, narcotics derived from cannabis and mandrake. And the image on this slide is cannabis, which was used as a remedy throughout that part of the world for a long time, and in the West for a long time until the early to mid-1900s. So oral medications, poultices, bathing in hot infusions are mentioned in the Assyrian herbal, as well as fumigations, which is inhaling certain things, suppositories, and enemas. So they had a pretty well-developed materia medica of medical treatments that they applied and methods by which they applied them. And we don't know anything about, we don't know much about what they were treating because we don't have case histories, and we don't know much about what their outcomes were either. The largest surviving medical treatise from ancient Mesopotamia is the Treatise of Medical Diagnosis and Prognoses, and that was written around 1600 BC across 40 cuneiform tablets, and the information in that is an amalgamation of several centuries of Mesopotamian medical knowledge. And there were also herbal and prescription texts that covered mostly supernatural concepts, but some had inclusion of some of these empirical therapies as well. And the earliest prescription texts that we have from this culture are from around 2000 BCE, and they have mostly rational treatment with less inclusions of spells and incantations. So there might have been an evolution, or it might have just been because of the separation of these different functions of medicine amongst the different types of practitioners. The early texts really established that the practice of medicine was very firmly in place many thousands of years ago, and we'll also see that obviously when we look at Chinese medicine and Indian Ayurvedic medicine later in the semester. So these are more systemic medical practices than we will see in some of the other tribal cultures, or if they had more systemic practices in the other tribal cultures, they weren't written down, and so we don't have the record of them. And so that's an important distinction to make. Oftentimes what we're studying of history is just what got written down. So the codification of medicine was an important aspect of medicine at this point in time, and you perhaps have heard of Hammurabi's Code from the 18th century BCE, and it was a cuneiform document that established laws relating to medical conduct. It defined acceptable medical fees for the first time in history, so it was dealing with ethics and what was ethical to charge, etc. Also laying out a sliding scale fee based on the class of the patient. So if the patient were worth more, their medical fee would be more. And there were systems of slavery within this culture, and so slaves or servants might be worth less and would be charged less. There were also punishments for injuries that were sustained from medical treatment being outlined. And so this may have led to a conservatism in medical treatment, because if a treatment were more aggressive and the person was seen to suffer from it, the doctor could be punished under this code. So that's really important. And so healers were very respected in society, and they belonged to the educated classes. They were trained in special schools that were associated with temples, and their training was confidential. And so it was not an oral tradition in the sense that we might consider a confidential system of medicine, but the medicine was passed down in a confidential way. It was also so rigidly codified at this time that it really changed little over the many millennia of this civilization. And Hammurabi's Code was a part of that rigidity. It was really from the time of writing up until the dawning of the Common Era, it was very rigidly adhered to. The regulations are very severe on doctors at this point in time. If a healer causes death or blindness to a highborn person, their hands would be cut off. Healers were not held accountable for illnesses and their outcomes, but those were seen as being due to some transgression against the gods by the patient. But for an injury that was actually treated by a healer, if the outcome was bad, then the healer was seen as being at fault. And so just to make that distinction, because I'm not sure that I said that clearly, illnesses were seen as being caused by the supernatural causes, and the doctors weren't held as accountable for driving those out, because those were seen as sort of being the patient's fault because they didn't please the gods, versus an injury. If a doctor were treating an injury and the outcome of an injury were bad, then the healer would be seen as being at fault for that. Healers didn't work on certain days of the month because they were considered unlucky, and it was unethical to attend to hopeless cases. So those that were seen as being beyond remedy were just left. And that's pretty harsh, but it's also might have been the reality of what they were needing to spend their time on, people that they could make a difference with. Also included in Hammurabi's Code were instructions for veterinarians, for barbers, dental surgeons, and wet nurses. And in an epilogue of the code, there was a terrible curse invoked on anyone who dared to alter the code. And that was probably why it was held to so rigidly for such a long period of time. The healers were stratified into ranks of importance. As I said before, the word has left me. The ones who were doing exorcisms, the exorcists, were the highest rank of importance among doctors. And all of the ranks of healers took an oath of office. So this may have been the first time that we see that kind of understanding of a medical oath. There's evidence that Egyptian medicine, which is in the next part of this lecture, may have been influenced by Mesopotamian medicine, but there's no significant indication that Mesopotamian medicine influenced later Greek rational medicine, despite the fact that geographically they were quite close together. So we've come to the end of part 2. Your revision questions are there and also on the LMS. And your other food for thought for this part: how do you think the development of writing influenced the development of medicine? So I'll leave you to think on that, and I'll see you in part 3. Thank you for joining.